In our previous episode, all the top talents had stepped into the ancestral grounds. Once inside, their attributes and skills were sealed, and the only way to regain power was by consuming these special fruits. However, no one expected the demon worshippers to infiltrate, but let's face it, the guy's about to have a very bad time. Lin stared him down, then summoned his scythe and began walking straight toward Joe. Joe thought he'd lost it, wondering if a mage dared to challenge him in close combat. He scoffed, remarking that he'd originally planned to save Lin for last, but now he was asking for it. Raising his sword, Joe shouted the command, "Slash!" and a powerful sword energy came tearing toward Lin. Meanwhile, our boy didn't even flinch. Eventually, the attack landed, or so it seemed, but all the damage was redirected and absorbed by the skellies in the summoning space, and Lin was completely unharmed. Joe's eyes went wide. He stumbled back a few steps, sweating profusely. He couldn't understand what just happened. He even suspected he'd missed the attack somehow. Shouting that it was impossible, he followed up with a stronger cross slash. Once again, the skill went through our boy and continued on, creating a massive crater behind him. However, Lin was still untouched. Now, Joe was starting to panic. Desperate, he unleashed his Holy Flame aura, a wide-range skill that blasted out in all directions. Everyone around felt a wave of burning heat sear across their skin. Someone shouted for everyone to take recovery potions, while a few worried aloud whether Lin could even survive that kind of damage. But the flames rolled toward him, and just like before, he didn't move a muscle. He simply stared at Joe as if he was watching a clown make a fool of himself. Joe instinctively backed away, gulping nervously as he asked what kind of monster Lin was. At first, he assumed Lin hadn't eaten any fruits, so his skills and stats weren't sealed. But then he realized that couldn't be true. Otherwise, Lin wouldn't have been able to summon his skeleton army. What truly shook Joe was that none of his attacks were working. He just couldn't understand why his skills were completely useless against him. Lin didn't bother wasting words. He calmly admitted that even without the skeletons, he could still kill Joe nonetheless. That only made Joe snap. Flushed with rage, he accused Lin of being arrogant, declaring that a mage had no business fighting a knight in close quarters. Since skills weren't working, he roared that he'd just take Lin's head off himself. Weapon raised, Joe charged straight at him, but Lin met the blow with his scythe and with a single counterattack, sent Joe flying. The dude couldn't believe our boy's strength and melee skills were actually better than his own, and questioned if he was supposed to be a mage. Meanwhile, folks clenched their fists and cheered for Lin, shouting for him to kill that bastard. Since our boy has gone through the Divine Tower trial, he's already familiar with every profession inside and out. After eating the first fruit, his base attributes had hit 10,000, although not outrageous, but more than enough for now. Joe, meanwhile, stumbled back and things were looking grim for him. He had clearly lost the upper hand, but he took a deep breath and consoled himself, convinced his own stats would still be much higher. With that in mind, he activated his finishing move. Sword energy exploded everywhere. The attack covered an even wider range than before, all aimed towards our boy. The crowd froze. With all his skills sealed, nobody thought Lin could survive something like that. Joe laughed as the blast engulfed Lin. The ground shook under the impact, and the explosion tore through the forest. He breathed heavily, convinced Lin was finally dead. But then, Lin appeared in front of him, completely unharmed. With a swift slash, the scythe tore through Joe's body. Lin stepped forward and declared that Joe was the one who would die today. Then he calmly pulled the scythe out. Joe stared in disbelief, then watched the gaping wound in his abdomen. He started shaking, mumbling over and over that it wasn't possible. That strike alone hadn't finished him, but Lin wasn't done yet. He casually pulled a weapon from his storage space, just a random boss drop, and stabbed it into Joe. Joe's eyes rolled back, but it still wasn't over. Lin didn't even bother withdrawing the blade. One after another, more weapons appeared in his hand, and one by one, he drove them into Joe's body. In the blink of an eye, Joe had been turned into a human pincushion. Somehow the dude is still alive, but now, for the first time, he was truly terrified. He screamed that Lin couldn't kill him. He begged for mercy, said he didn't want to die, that he was still useful. He could tell Lin everything about the demon worshippers. Lin only shook his head because he didn't believe a lapdog like Joe had access to any real secrets. Just like that, he drew one last weapon and finished him. At the same time, the skill that had bound everyone vanished. They rushed over to thank Lin. One person remarked that Divine General Lin was incredible, killing that bastard even with sealed stats and no active skills. The others quickly chimed in, saying if Lin hadn't stepped in, they'd all be dead by now. Lin humbly replied that there was no need for thanks, explaining that they were all humans after all. A few of them clenched their fists and reassured him that once they made it out, the Zhou family wouldn't get away with this. With the barrier finally gone, everyone started discussing their next steps. Mohan gave Lin a teasing look and said her little brother was making waves lately, and maybe it was time to start calling him Divine General Lin too. Yi Yi and Mo Yun both chuckled, while Lin scratched the back of his head and told his sister not to tease him. Their journey continued until they reached a bridge hanging over a massive cliff. Everyone paused at the edge as Mohan's expression turned serious. She explained that stepping onto the bridge marked the beginning of the second phase of the trial. From here on, they'd each have to face it alone, and how far they went would depend entirely on themselves, then wished everyone luck. Lin was the first to step forward. Thick fog blanketed the far side of the bridge, and once he vanished into it, they all followed. As the scene shifts back to Joe, the dude still looks like a human pincushion. A vine emerged from the ground, wrapping tightly around him. It dragged him down below, and the ground soon closed back up behind it, as if nothing had ever happened. Meanwhile, Lin found himself standing on a stone platform, a sword embedded upright in its center. His detection spell identified it as a low-grade skill monument. He stepped closer and saw that the stone bore carved images and writing. It introduced a basic sword skill called Wind Slash. Almost immediately, the carvings began to move, and Lin realized he needed to learn this skill. He checked out the other two monuments nearby. One offered Wood Slash, the other Stone Slash. Lin remarked that the three choices clearly represented agility, finesse, and raw strength. Although he was a mage, his training in the Divine Tower had covered skills from various professions, and he confidently asserted this wouldn't be a problem. As the scene shifts to an unlucky contestant, the guy is devastated to know he has to learn sword skills despite being a mage himself. Meanwhile, Li Feng, the same guy who landed on the bunny earlier, is even more devastated, staring at a monument he couldn't even read. He murmured, half in horror, whether squashing that little creature was now coming back to haunt him. Turned out, killing animals in the trial thickened the surrounding fog, making it almost impossible to see the carvings on the monument. After mastering Wind Slash, Lin returned to the platform to see what the next part of the trial had in store. He drew the long sword embedded in the center, and as the mist around him thickened, a puppet materialized before him. Lin quickly figured that this trial wanted him to use the skill he had just learned to defeat the puppet. Raising the sword, a streak of blue light wrapped around the blade like a lightsaber. But the puppet moved shockingly fast, lunging at him in an instant. Lin barely blocked it, nearly taking a hit. Since all skills and attributes were sealed, the only way to win was to rely on the newly learned abilities. The more fruits someone had consumed, the higher their base stats would be, making this fight much easier. But Lin, having eaten the first fruit, already had his attributes stacked high. He deflected the puppet's next attack, then followed up immediately with Wind Slash. A sharp wave of energy burst forth, slicing the puppet into pieces on the spot. The shattered remains dissolved into a glowing mist, which flowed into Lin and boosted his stats by another 500 points. Elsewhere, though, things weren't going so smoothly. Most others were still struggling with their puppets. Back to Lin, he pressed forward, soon arriving at what he identified as the third phase of the trial. Suddenly, the system informed him that he had forgotten the skill Wind Slash. He now understood what the principle meant by most people couldn't remember what happened after finishing the third phase. This new platform had 4 stone monuments, each with a different mage skill. Lin grinned and remarked, finally the correct profession this time. The fight that followed was far easier than before. He quickly finished off the next puppet and was rewarded with 1,000 attribute points. And finally, it was Phase 4. Meanwhile, outside the ancestral grounds, Li Feng was suddenly ejected from the secret realm and slammed hard into the ground. His grandpa rushed to his side in panic, asking if he was okay. Gasping for breath, he slowly sat up still, looking dazed, finally realizing he had been eliminated. However, he couldn't even recall what happened after crossing the bridge. However, he remembered something and shouted to his grandpa that something had gone wrong inside the ancestral grounds. This drew everyone's attention, and he further explained that Joe had joined the demon worshippers and become their pawn, adding that he hadn't consumed any fruits like everyone else, and instead, he waited until everyone else was vulnerable and even used a soul annihilation stone to prevent them from reviving.